Written in Stone is co-created by Power Company Climbing. Products, training plans, and education to help you become a better climber. PowerCompanyClimbing.com. Use the code STONE, that's STONE, for 20% off of almost everything. Learn, grow, excel. Season 1 of Written in Stone, the 1990s, is supported by Tension Climbing. Wooden training tools designed with purpose in Denver, Colorado. Use the code STONE, that's STONE, to get 10% off of your next purchase at tensionclimbing.com and to let them know that their support for this show matters. Not valid for tension board sets, hardware, or gift cards. Cannot be combined with other offers. tensionclimbing.com. Mastery over success. Climbing has never been solely about, and no climber has ever explored their own limits by focusing only on the difficulty of the moves or the grade associated with that difficulty. Instead, there's something deeper that unlocks the ability to do the hardest things you're capable of, things that may not carry the numerical weight commensurate with the effort required. And so, when a great climber finds a relatively low-graded oddity that they just can't seem to do, they don't avoid it. They lean in. Sure, they can go through the entire range of emotions, excitement at progress, but also frustration at watching other people do it easily. Because climbing is, well, hard. And when we get better, we continue to seek harder. And that's why, on September 19th, 2019, after having fallen off of his crux, which wasn't the crux for everyone else, more than 50 times previous, Tension Climbing founder Will Anglin sat at the starting holds of Top Notch in Rocky Mountain National Park with mixed feelings. He'd realized he had taught himself all of the ways to do the dyno slightly wrong, and he'd made a conscious effort to undo that learning. But undoing learning is tricky business, often leaving you unsure of which direction you're even headed. But he pulled on anyway, and fell straight away at the moves he'd done damn near every time, using multiple methods. After 4 more false starts, he thought, maybe it's just not my day. And here, right here, is where many of us pack it in. But it wasn't Will's day for that either. Instead, he pulled on once more, this time eking his way through the start moves, everyone else's crux, and let all of his learning, unlearning, and relearning do its work. And he stuck the hold. See, ego is affected by numbers, but true pride isn't. It's anchored in another place entirely. And so, while Top Notch at V13 isn't Will's most numerically difficult send, it certainly sits among his most proud. Will Anglin, welcome to Written in Stone. I'm so psyched to have you here chatting about Fred Nicole.
Thanks for having me.
Man, before we dive in, I have a question for you that while I was preparing for this conversation, I kept wondering. Your style is similar to Fred's in the way that you both exhibit a high level of control in difficult positions. I think that's one of the hallmarks of your climbing. If you and Fred were both up for a role in a Disney live-action movie where you had to play a sloth, who's going to get the role, you or Fred?
Oh my gosh, Fred, for sure.
I really just want to see Fred as a sloth. That's my whole goal in life now.
He takes it to another level, for sure. For me, I think I get close to controlling a position and then can end up kind of coasting through part of it with a momentum element.
Yeah.
I was just watching the video of Fred doing Shosholoza, the first ascent in Rocklands, and he just does it like nobody does it. So slow, complete control. It's so rare to see people climb like that. Actually, Twig climbs like that.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
He's one of the only other people I have seen actually climb like Fred climbs. And it's really cool to see.
Yeah, it's such a singular thing. Like I remember watching early videos and was just entranced by how he controlled every single aspect of every move. It was wild. And it wasn't until a lot later actually that I connected a lot of dots with Fred because I had this idea that like Fred was always like super calm and ethereal and chill when he climbed because that's what his style sort of evokes, you know? But then you see a photo like and as I became a better climber, I saw this photo in a new light. And the one I'm talking about is a Sandra Studer photo of Fred on Alma Blanca, which I think you've done, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in that photo, he's like super fierce determination on his face, and he's setting up for that big, like, cross move, and he's in this tiny little box that he's going to have to explode out of, and, using the word explode with Fred means something totally different than everyone else, but that changed my mind about bouldering. Like, I thought bouldering was because of seeing Fred, I thought bouldering was this super controlled, like, bear down on everything, but don't let your face show it, And Chris Sharma was the opposite of that. And then I saw finally, oh, Fred's got this fierceness. And, Fred can go really hard and he can get in tiny box and explode it out of them. And he just changed my mind about it all multiple times.
Yeah, he's definitely given it, even though it might not look like it. And it's funny, sometimes you see climbers like that and it looks, at least when you're looking at them from the back because they're climbing something,
Yeah. Yeah.
like they're slow and composed, and then all of a sudden something happens and they fall and they just go flying off the wall. Like, holy
Hmm.
cow, that was a lot of force. It did not look like they were doing that, but like the actual force they're applying to the wall is really, really high. They're trying really hard.
Yeah, they're just wound up like a spring on there, and any release is gonna just result in major explosion.
Yes.
Yeah, it's so cool. I think besides just Fred's style, there are a lot of ways that we can be inspired by what he brought to climbing. What are the top ways that he's informed the way you approach climbing?
Yeah, this is an interesting question because there's been a lot of different climbers over the history of climbing that have had these kinds of impacts.
Totally.
And I think the thing that is so interesting to me about Fred is how not just the difficulty of the climbing, which that's kind of the obvious thing to point to, the first person to do V13, V14, and V15, which is such a huge leap in difficulty from where
Yeah.
it was at that time. And he had contemporaries who uh, were also pushing the limits at that time as well. But it's the kind of the climbs that he chose, what he actually chose
Mm,
to climb on, what those boulders looked like, what those moves were. And I think that almost more than the difficulty is kind of the impact that he's had moving forward is in a very real way, kind of what bouldering looks like today
mm.
can really be attributed somewhat back to like one person, and that's Fred, whether it's the climbs that he did in Switzerland or Waco tanks or Rocklands. The like I said, the difficulty was there, but the aesthetic of the line or the lack of aesthetic,
Yeah.
depending on what that line was, and even just listening to interviews with him or things where he's talking about the climbing and the feeling that he seems to be going for is something that I find really interesting and inspiring, and something that I've kind of tried to embody myself in some way, trying to find what that feeling is that I'm looking for, and figuring out what pieces of rock can facilitate that. And it's not always the prettiest thing, but sometimes it is. So yeah, just I think I think what he chose to climb on is really interesting.
Yeah, I do too. And this is something I've talked with several people about. Like I had this conversation with Eric Jerome and Max Solitukin a couple of years ago. And just recently, I interviewed Adam Ondra for this season of Written in Stone. And we were talking about how a climb can have basically three things. It can have the beautiful line. It can climb really well, and it can have world-class difficulty. And to find one that has all three is really, really special, but you don't need all three to be inspired by it. And I think Adam Onder is a great example of this, and that he goes and does these, like, for lack of a better term off the top of my head, these little bullshit routes and boulders that no one else wants to climb on, but he gets psyched on them and he does them. And it might only have one of those factors.
Yeah.
And it seems like Fred did that as well, because a lot of the things he climbed in Waco, you walk up to them and you're like, oh, this is a Fred Nicole boulder. Wait a minute. This doesn't look that cool, But he applied himself to it in the same way he applied himself to Dreamtime, which I think is really brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Something I've been thinking about recently is self-expression in climbing, and it's something that's become more valuable to me through the years. And I think it's something that's really apparent in Fred's climbing and those climbing choices. In climbing, we have a lot of freedom, but in a lot of ways we're constrained. You can't do whatever you want. You kind of have to do what the rock's telling you to do. And
we also have a lot of rules swirling around in our head all the time, especially bouldering.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
like, where do you start? Where do you finish? What moves do you do in between? And does that count?
Exactly. But one of the things that we definitely can choose is what we climb on. And from a development perspective, that's expanded, where you're walking through a boulder field and just whatever happens to catch your eye or makes you feel a certain way or gets you excited, that can be a form of self-expression. I think that's something that we see a lot of the great and kind of influential climbers do.
Yeah.
The stuff Dave sees is stuff that nobody else sees. And the stuff that Fred saw at the time is stuff that no one else was really looking at. And now it seems so obvious when you walk up to a wall in Waco and there's all these little thin like ear comes. You're like, oh yeah, that's a boulder problem, that goes. But previous to Fred just brickhousing those things, it wasn't a part of the conception of like the greater climbing community as much as it is now, certainly.
Yeah, and this episode in particular is about Ladance and Raja, which I think are an interesting comparison, because they're on the same boulder. They share some moves. One of them is clearly a like straight up line that tops out the boulder. The other is a traverse that just goes across the boulder. And a lot of people nowadays sort of shit on traverses, like they're not as valid or whatever as a straight up line. And Fred just didn't seem to care. I mean, I can't confirm what he did on the first ascent, or I haven't been able to yet. I'm still trying. But in the video of his repeat that Udo Newman has out there, his repeat of La Danse, he just steps off. He doesn't top out. And I don't know if he topped that boulder out for his first ascent. So I think it's really interesting that he did the traverse first. He was really inspired by traverses. It's what he trained on. It's what he first got excited about in climbing. And then he finds this traverse that turns out to be the first V13 in the world. And I think that sets him up for doing Raja. So there's importance in those like lines that we sometimes shit on a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think a lot of the early bouldering was traversing. And there's a
Yeah.
whole kind of separate way of grading traverses. And I think these days, and it may even be able to be attributed somewhat to kind of the uh, development of the bouldering pad, you know,
Totally.
actually being able to go up there and not break your legs probably influenced people to actually go up there. And prior to that, climbing 15 feet and hitting rocks probably wasn't on folks' list of things to do. So I think it's a culture thing now where it's not as much what folks are looking for. It doesn't seem as quote unquote proud to do a traverse. And I think that's in some ways pretty reasonable, like a traverse doesn't look that sweet. Some of them do.
Sure.
Some of them are actually like really cool. But yeah, it's interesting how all the different factors that come into play that sort of shape the taste and what people think is cool or worth time. I mean, a lot of the firsts, and there are a lot of hard things that are like full on contrivances that don't look cool at all, aren't comfortable, don't climb well, just about the worst stuff. But a lot of times, it's, I think with bouldering, the act of doing it, at least for me, is kind of the point, as opposed to that actual rock,
Yeah.
And I think that leaves more space for things like that. It doesn't really have to look sweet. It doesn't have to be quote unquote proud. It doesn't necessarily even have to top out. There's some sweet drop offs in the world.
Yeah.
And I think it's definitely, it's more to do with your experience on the thing and what that means to you and whether you're enjoying yourself or not.
Yeah. I think that actually, we could just stop the podcast right there and be like, yeah, that's all of it. That's the whole experience right there. But I do think, we tend to heap praise on these historical figures, like Fred, and then we go back and look at the history, and we've sort of written this revisionist history about these figures. Like John Gill was a boulder. He didn't top rope. Well, yes, he did. He top roped a lot of the boulders he did. And Fred didn't fully top out a lot of the boulders he still gets credit for doing, even though people top them out now. And I think that's totally fine. We just tend to write this revisionist history based on our current culture and what we value. And I think Fred is a really fabulous lesson in what we should be valuing. And I think you're right on that it's the experience, and that the rock isn't necessarily the thing that allows you to have that experience. That's you. You're just choosing the rock you're going to display that on.
Yeah, it's like the boulder isn't the bouldering, you're the bouldering. The boulder's a boulder.
Wow. You're the bouldering. I love it. We can't talk about bouldering. We can't talk about Fred. We've already brought up grades because he was so instrumental in pushing the level of bouldering up dramatically. He was also one of the best at like walking the line between using grades and caring about them, but then not putting too much weight on them. After Fred, I think the next like big boom in bouldering was partly Chris Sharma. And Sharma very famously refused to grade a lot of things. In my opinion, that's caring about grades even more, because now you're like giving them this power. Fred would give a grade and move on. how do you think we can continue to use grades responsibly?
And
I know
the
that's a giant question.
it's it's one of my favorite ones though, which is kind of ironic in some ways. It's in many ways it's the least consequential part of the whole deal. It's the thing that matters
Absolutely.
the least. But it is also one of my favorite things to talk about. And I've held different opinions over the years, and I
Mm,
think where I'm at now uh, is just do your best to give your honest opinion, and then just move to the Fred example. Just move on,
yeah.
because it's not really on you as an individual to get it quote unquote right. You
Yeah.
just need to give the best representation of what your experience was. And if everybody focused on doing that and that only, then consensus could almost work. Where now it's really tough because there are so many incentive structures built into the way that we
Mm,
interact with grades and climbing that it's tough to understand if the opinion you're getting of the grade is really what that person feels or not.
yeah.
And that just sort of skews everything over time. And I think people are just so hell bent on comparing themselves to other people.
Mhm.
And that can and I will say there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's competition. It's
There's some big
everywhere.
positives to comparison.
Yeah, it's not inherently bad, but it does inherently carry some baggage along with it. And to to not to not come to terms with that, I think, it makes us miss things.
Yeah, I think, you sort of hinted at something there, talking about how the whole grading scale can be thrown off and consensus can be thrown off because you never know if you're getting an honest opinion. And I've seen this trend lately in the last couple of years where a pro climber will do something and then they will openly say, I'm scared to call it this grade. Like, I think it might be that grade, but I don't have the courage. I think Adam Onder actually wrote in a comment on 8A, I don't have the courage to call it the next grade. We've seen either Stefano or Seb Buen, I can't remember which, saying, "Yeah, I think it's probably this, but I don't want it to get downgraded. So I'm going to call it this." Why are we so concerned about the downgrade? Why do we see that as such a huge negative against the person who did it?
Yeah, that's interesting, and I don't know, you know, I'm in my mid 30s. I haven't been around that long, so I'm not sure how how far all this goes back, but the climbing community is really interesting in that it seems to be pretty quick to attack.
Yeah,
and and I don't totally know why that is, but it's interesting to me that downgrading is seems like such a negative thing. And it's like if something gets one downgrade, everyone automatically assumes that it's that easier grade. But if somebody gives it
yeah,
one
yeah,
upgrade, nobody ever assumes that it's that upgraded grade.
right,
And so it's kind of like a race to the bottom. And I mean, it seems fairly obvious to me that there's a significant ego component where, like,
sure,
saying,
has
oh,
to
well,
be.
this felt easy to me, making me better than you, kind of a thing. And what's crazy about that to me is that like climbing is so variable. Everyone's body is so different. The
Yeah.
beta on some climbs can be almost unrecognizable, like person to person, depending on their size and shape and strengths and weaknesses. And to really come out and be like, no, what I like, my experience is like the pinnacle of validity, and what I say it goes kind of thing, is an odd position to take for something that is so subjective and variable. And yeah, I mean, when I do things, I'll downgrade them or upgrade them or take the grade, or I just try these days to try to make the grade that I take as honest of a reflection of the experience that I had as I can, which is also flawed because my perception changes over time. Am I in shape?
Sure.
Am I not in shape? Is this a style
Yeah.
I'm good at or bad at or whatever? But just making an effort,
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to go about it, give your honest reflection of it. And I think if you're doing that, you have to recognize that if someone else gives their honest reflection and it's a grade lower than what you believed it was, that's not a negative reflection on you. That's just a reflection on how they found that rock climb. I think we tend to take these downgrades personal, and lots of Fred's firsts have been, or at least his early climbs have been downgraded. And I hear some people like have a hard time saying this Fred Nicole boulder is easier than the grade he gave it. Even though like our technology has changed dramatically, our techniques have changed dramatically, our ability to see 40 different send videos and get all the beta has made it easier for us to climb these boulders. Crash pads, like you said, we might roll up to a boulder with a posse that's got 25 crash pads between the group. And it's basically become a gym floor where Fred had one little pad or something. So we tend to put too much weight on that history and on the grade that other people found them, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting example is Dreamtime, right?
Mm-hmm.
He
Totally.
put it up as V15, and then it broke like pretty catastrophically. It's super different, the crux move than it used to be, and the crux move is harder than it
Mm.
used to be, but it still is often, uh, folks will call it V14, and I think that's an kind of illuminates what the influence of climbing gyms has been, and the ability to explore movement in a more controlled environment and then to apply that outside. Because
Yeah.
when Fred originally did that, climbing gyms were not what they are today. They existed, but
Right.
even the style in those gyms was, I mean, if you put somebody today in one of those gyms, they would be like, "What? It's like this is horrible. Why would I even want to be in here?
Yeah.
This is crazy." Uh, and now the level at which that kind of dynamic style has grown, things that used to seem hard potentially because of a lack of experience in that kind of movement, because it wasn't really being explored in the same way at the time. Like
Mm-hmm.
those big jumps felt really hard, probably. Like I mean, they still feel hard to me. I think that thing's nails, but uh, just the level of the climbing community as a whole has risen across all these different aspects that in the late 90s, early 2000s just weren't a part of what people's climbing vocabulary was. And so it makes
Yeah.
sense that certain things today don't seem as hard as they did prior.
Totally. And I mean, when you're jumping in slow motion like Fred, like you're in the Matrix or something, um, it gets its own grading scale anyway.
Yeah, watching him do some of the stuff, uh, like Chablanc in Waco, like the way that he did it, like just so slow off of that pinch. I mean, if I had to do it that way, if somehow climbing were, maybe like more like gymnastics or ice skating, and that exact way that you performed the move was a part of how you were, you know, successful or not,
Yep.
I don't think I could do it.
Totally.
uh, and I think that's cool that we can all sort of find different solutions, and something that feels just totally heinous to one person for one reason or another can feel not so bad to somebody else. And, that actually, I think, makes climbing more interesting, not less
Oh, I do
interesting.
too. I do too. Absolutely. You brought up Dreamtime, and Dreamtime is in the same lineage as La Danse and Raja, V13, V14, V15, first in the world. And there's this constant argument in climbing about which climbs were the first of a grade. Like we hold those in the spotlight. Like this was
Hmm.
the first. And in my research for this season, what I'm discovering is there's lots of debate because there were several climbers all kind of getting there at once. And I can see the historical interest in that argument of which actually was the first. Again, though, we're coming back to a subjective thing like a grade. So, how can you say which one was objectively the first? But I also just feel like we're getting that conversation wrong in a lot of ways by putting so much emphasis on which climb was the first and not which group of climbs and climbers were the ones pushing that barrier forward.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think it in some ways calls back to the grading conversation we were just having, where like it is subjective, so it's really tough to say who did the first of what grade, because somebody could think it's not that great, or a whole group of people could think it's not that great. And so at what point is it or is it not that thing? And
Right.
and who did it first? And even, as I was thinking about this question, like, well, maybe it makes more sense to think about who was the first to do a climb, because that's a little bit more
Mm.
definable, right? But even
Mhm.
then, stuff breaks all the time. Stuff
Totally.
polishes. I mean, the climate in certain places is significantly different than it was uh, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
The shoes that people were wearing, whether they had chalk or not, whether they had crack, it's it's the whole like can't step in the same river twice thing. It's really tough to define, what these quote unquote first accomplishments are. And I think it is, like you said, a bit of a red herring. Like when I think about Fred or someone like Joe Soon or Dave Graham, I'm not, I don't necessarily, the first thing I think about isn't, oh, well, this person did the first 14 B, C, and D, or
Right.
whatever. It's often them more as like a mythic figure. I think it's,
Mhm.
it, and in some ways we don't have as many mythic figures as we did, just because everything is in some ways a little bit more transparent than it used to be. You
For
see
sure.
accomplishments like in real time on Instagram, or we just watched Jakob Schubert send maybe the hardest route in the world
Yeah.
live. You know,
Live.
right?
Wild.
So like, it doesn't really leave room for a legend about it,
Totally.
true or not. And so when I think about people like Fred, it's more like a feeling of like this mythical creature who just, you know, pushed the boundaries of the sport, not, and it's less important to describe how granular it was that he pushed it, just the fact
Yeah.
that he you know, put modern hard bouldering kind of on the map. Waco, Rocklands, Switzerland. It's that stuff. And then you can argue all you want about what those climbs are graded and whatever. But the reality is lost to time at this point, probably.
Yeah,
Which
and
is
I
kind
think
of cool.
yeah, for sure. I think one of the most interesting things about it is like if we look at, say, the 4-minute mile barrier, um, lots of people were getting close, and then Roger Bannister just happens to be the first to cross that barrier, and then it happens several more times pretty quickly. And I think with something even more subjective, like the grade of a boulder, it takes someone with, to use Adam Ondra's word, the courage to say, this is the next level for other climbers to be able to say, okay, now that level is available to us. So now we can start saying, yes, this is that level. When before, maybe some of them didn't have that courage to say it. So it just takes one person to like push the level up in the in the feeling, in the thoughts of the other top climbers, and then they can all sort of fill in the spaces. And I think that's the most beautiful thing about this. Like Fred opened up V13, V14, V15. He didn't open it up for Fred. He opened it up for climbing. Whether those boulders stand as the first of that grade for the people who want to nitpick about, what's what, isn't the point for me. The point is he opened it up in the thought process and in the experience for everyone else.
Yeah, he opened it up conceptually. Whether those
Yeah.
climbs necessarily stand up to that kind of grade rigor over time is irrelevant, like full on. And it's also worth mentioning, and I think you did earlier. It doesn't happen in a vacuum either.
Totally.
There are contemporaries that pushed Fred, and anyone who's been a first, maybe or maybe not in something, has had people around them that have helped facilitate that in one form or another.
Totally. Like when I was planning this season of Written in Stone, it was like I'm going to choose 10 important ascents from that decade, but there's so many more people I want to talk about who don't come into play for those 10, and it was hard to whittle it down to 10. Like how do we not talk about Clem Loscott when
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about Fred? Like the two are inseparable in my mind because I'm looking at it now as there's this larger zeitgeist moving that barrier forward a little at a time, and Clem did the second ascent of Raja and then very quickly followed up with his own V14 Nanook, among many other things that he did that are, we're moving the sport forward. So you're right. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. And I'm part of the problem by saying Fred gets the credit here.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's hard not to make a rule for yourself when you're talking about these things.
Well, and I think we like that as people. You know, we like these legendary figures, and have forever. It's what's painted on cave walls,
Mhm.
and whether it's quote unquote true or not, it's what we latch onto, and it's a part of how we tell these stories, whether it's about the people themselves or how we contextualize ourselves within sort of the larger story of climbing. We point to these different figures as guideposts, maybe, or maybe they come to represent certain things that we as a community value, and we kind of project that stuff onto these people, whether they were that way or not.
Totally.
kind of doesn't matter. And that is something I miss about the way climbing, and again, I'm pretty young, so it's kind of insane to say this, but the way climbing was,
Used
you
to
know,
be in the old
it
days.
it just it there's less room for those legends, and I really appreciate folks like like Griffin Whiteside.
Mm,
It's like you don't even know what he has or hasn't done, but he's kind of a mythic figure, at least out here in Colorado. I'm like, well, if Griffin's been to this area, I assume that he's done all this stuff. Like maybe he did,
yeah.
maybe he didn't. Sort of doesn't matter. It's just fun.
Yeah, I talked to Griffin once at a trade show and was like, man, I really want to do this series on like the dark horses, the mythic figures that that no one knows about. Would you be on the podcast? And he was like, well, then I wouldn't be someone no one knows about anymore. I was like, fuck, you have a point.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's totally true that we aren't leaving room for the legends the way they were. I hadn't really thought about that before, at least not in too much depth, but that is one of the things that make people like Fred and Clem and all of these heroes that we hold up from back then so enticing. But you said something really interesting there that we we think we know what they were like, and you will hear people say, well, Fred did it this way, so that's how I'm going to do it too, when in a lot of cases we have no idea how Fred did it. We're just assuming we know. And when I was watching the video of Fred doing La Dance, I was really surprised that he just casually drops in this knee bar. Um, and I was like, wow, I just had no idea that knee bars were even a thing back then. Not to mention that he would just casually use it. They're so hotly contested now. But again, this goes right back to like Fred didn't really care. He was just climbing for himself and to be climbing and looking for things that could move climbing forward. And maybe the rest of us weren't ready.
I mean, we've got knees, don't we?
Totally, totally. I'm
like
all
we,
for the record, I am all for knee bars.
yeah. Like we have feet, we put rubber on that. We've got knees,
Yeah,
like why not put rubber on that? We're putting rubber on the like hand jams now. If putting rubber on our fingertips helped, like we would be doing that.
we would do it.
Uh, yeah, it is an interesting question about I mean knee bars specifically, and I think earlier on I was pretty disparaging about knee bars, and as
Mm.
time's gone on, I can't quite figure out what I really thought my argument was. Um, because like when I look at it now, I'm like it's a technique like any other thing that we've been doing as climbers the whole time in one form or another.
The whole time.
It's
Yeah.
it's certainly changed, and the advent of like an actual usable, comfortable knee pad is in some sense relatively new. And so the application of that technique has broadened pretty quickly. And I think again to go back to the grade thing, I think it's something that really hits a nerve for folks when things get downgraded because a knee bar is
Mm.
found, or especially in a case where a knee bar that maybe when the climb was originally graded wasn't possible due to the knee pad technology or something like
Right.
that.
Yeah.
And I mean, on one hand, that's understandable, and on the other hand, like all sorts of things change over time that affect the grades. And, knee barring is just another technique and another thing that makes climbing interesting, another way to kind of turn your body into a puzzle piece for some chunk of rock. And there's also this misconception that knee barring is easy,
Yeah,
because
totally.
in a lot of cases it will make a climb easier.
Mm-hmm.
But and to be sure, there are some like lock in, take a nap kind of knee bars, and yes, that's easy. But at a lot of this, it's not easy. It's actually quite hard,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a technique that a person needs to develop, and along with any other climbing technique, and to learn it enough to be able to apply it, and to see it on things that have already been climbed without it. It's just another cool thing, I think.
Yeah, I was researching Akira, the first thing ever called 15B,
Hmm.
by Fred Ruling for this season, and he mentions in an interview, that when it was finally repeated, there were all these tow hooks and bicycles, and he's like, "Try tow hooking in, Boreal lasers or whatever from the early '90s. It doesn't work, you're not gonna unless it's a bucket that you're tow hooking in, it's not the same, but now we have shoes that are covered in rubber specifically for tow hooking and open up a lot of options. I see that really similar to the knee pad, actually.
Yeah, yeah. Everything we're always we're always trying to improve that, right? I mean, even now, you're like, yeah, like the shoes are covered in rubber, and they kind of aren't. And I'm like, why not? Just cover my
Yeah,
foot in rubber, please. It's
totally.
not a climbing day goes by where I'm like, why is there not rubber here? This is insane. Who's designing these things? Like, don't you understand? Like, we just want rubber. uh,
Everywhere. Put it
and
everywhere.
it's yeah, I don't know. It just continues to unlock new things, and I
Yeah,
think you can choose to look at it uh, in a way where it's you could think that it's destroying all this stuff that's already previously been done or whatever, and it, you wouldn't be wrong, but that's not that great of a way to look at it, in my opinion. I choose to look at it as something where it opens up all sorts of new possibilities for the future, and that's
yeah,
interesting.
evolution. Yeah, I want to wrap this up by, asking. I think we've already sort of covered this, but asking, what do you think is the most important thing Fred has contributed to climbing? And you've given me so many new things to think about. Number one, something you said just in a moment, and then you ran right by it, was that we use these figures to contextualize ourselves. And that's really fantastic. I really do love the visual of having this like line of figures and using them to see where I'm at. Not just, as soon as I say that, I'm like, oh, everybody thinks I'm talking about grades, but that's not it at all. There's style, there's approach, there's all of these things that these figures, all of the figures I'm talking about this season brought to climbing. The courage to say, this is the next grade. The courage to say, I can do this even though everyone thinks I can't. Those sorts of things are the way I use these figures to contextualize my own climbing experience. And I had never really thought about that until you said it. For me, that's maybe one of the most important things Fred has really contributed.
Yeah, and I think that kind of hits the nail on the head, and was what I was gonna how I was gonna answer that question of what is or what has been Fred's biggest contribution to climbing. And I think it's the legend, you know,
Mm,
and the place that he sort of occupies in all of our minds, and whether how accurate that is to the actual man is somewhat irrelevant. He's become a figure
totally.
bigger than himself. And, when I think about Fred, I just think about like a master in the woods, just doing his thing,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and not overly concerned with what anybody else might think of it, just kind of pursuing what drives him, what excites him, and what he just wants to do. But bringing that kind of intensity and relentlessness to it that has allowed him to
Mm,
push the difficulty as well. And how true that is, I don't know, but that's the figure in my mind, and that's kind of what I want to be.
yeah,
And that's cool.
yeah.
I like that.
Well, in the lineage of climbing philosophers, and I certainly put Fred in there, even though I don't know if he ever tried to be a philosopher of climbing, but I think the things he has done and said carry a lot of weight. In that lineage where many people have depicted climbing as this entirely ethereal thing, um, I really believe that you are one of the most down to earth of climbing's philosophers who sees all sides of this beautiful and at the same time sometimes soul crushing thing that we practice. So I appreciate that, and I think you are one of those figures. So,
Oh man, that's really nice. Thanks.
well, man, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to do this, to chat about Fred, and for helping get this season of Written in Stone out into the world. What you do at Tension and what the whole team over there at Tension does means a lot. I feel like you're pushing climbing forward in a similar way, just in a new age, as what Fred was doing and as what all the legends we're talking about this season are doing. So I appreciate you guys being on board with this season.
Yeah, man. Thanks. Thanks for doing this, and thanks for having me on.
Written in Stone is produced by me, Chris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush and Emily Holland for Plug Tone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. At the link in your show notes, you'll find all the things you expect and probably some you don't. And look, this show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. If you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review. And tell everyone you know at the crag, at the gym. Follow the pod on your friends' phones and share it all over your social medias. And together, we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, one decade at a time. Stoners. I missed you all. We didn't have any conversations through the whole back of last week. It feels like I haven't talked to you in a month. I don't miss things very often, but I did miss sitting down here and talking to you all. Couple of things. Number one, Will Anglin is a fucking joy to talk to. He's just one of the people I love to pontificate with. Am I using that word correctly? No, I am definitely not. I just looked it up, and pontificate is on the annoying side or the dogmatic side, and that's the opposite. That's exactly the opposite of what Will does. It's more examining and theorizing or deliberating, something to that effect. Anyway, he's one of my favorite people to sit down with and talk about hike around the rocks with and talk about the ideas and the ideals and just climbing philosophy in general. It's a good time. If you ever get the chance, you should absolutely do it. And also, tension is a big reason why this season of Written in Stone could happen. So please support those guys. Use the code STONE over there at tensionclimbing.com for 10% off. They make the best collection of training tools out there, period. I don't even need to say anything else about it, period. That's it. Also, another thing I've been thinking about, Emily and Riley and I recently met to talk about YouTube. Do we want to take this thing onto YouTube? But ultimately, I don't know how we could keep the bar as high. There's not that much money in it. So if any of you out there have any great ideas about YouTube, or you're really good and really fast at animation, that would be cool too. Hit me up. Let me know. Speaking of YouTube, I just finished watching a video that got me really psyched. If you're interested, I'm not a big YouTuber, but recently I've been working on a sport climbing project that's got me excited. I'm seeing little bits of progress on a, anti-style, hard for me sport climb. And I just watched Tom O'Halloran's Hump of Trouble project video, literally 30 seconds before I started recording this, and it's brilliant. It's vulnerable. It shows the process, probably better than any sport climbing video I've ever seen. Pretty incredible. Tom, if you're listening, thank you for that. And all of you listening should definitely go check out that video on YouTube. And that's pretty much all I got for now. We've got 3 conversations this week. This was number 1. We've got 2 more. In 2 days, on Wednesday, is one of the best climbing journalists who's written about Fred before and has seen a lot of really brilliant climbers in his time up close and personal. He's also a podcaster. And if you're familiar with the old The Ledge podcast, you know who I'm talking about. Anyway, it's a good one. It's a fun one. I really enjoyed talking with him, and you will get to hear that on Wednesday. Then we got another one on Friday, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I will see you all in a couple of days.